This message comes from NPR sponsor 1Password. Secure access to your online world, from emails to banking, so you can protect what matters most with 1Password. For a free 2-week trial, go to onepassword.com/NPR.
What's good? I'm Gene Demby, and you are listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. And today on the show, we want to take you to Altadena, California. Altadena, as you might remember from the recent news, is the site of one of the two major wildfires that ravaged Los Angeles County. So much of Altadena was decimated by the Eaton fire. More than 9,000 homes and businesses and schools and houses of worship, they were just all leveled by the flames and the winds.
The embers, they were pretty big, and everywhere they hit, they would just start up because of the wind.
Every street you turn on, there was fire or there was a tree fell over. Down. Yeah.
And we want to zoom in on Altadena because it occupies this really code-switchy place in Los Angeles and in California more broadly. Altadena is a mostly brown place with a large, long-tenured Black population. Back during the Civil Rights era, it was one of the few places in LA County where Black folks could buy homes. So if you were a Black person in California and you wanted to get a piece of the American dream, this is a place you could do it. Jackie Robinson has roots in Altadena. Rodney King grew up there. Octavia Butler is buried there. And so a lot of the history of Black Los Angeles is threaded through this place. And for many of the families who settled there, that loss of community is the hardest thing to come to grips with right now.
But the elders that worked hard to leave some for the next generation in the years to come, it ain't fair to them at all.
What's devastating now about the fires is that there's always going to be a gap. Even if you replace what you had, the equitable growth in your property will not be like it was before.
I've cried so much that I can't cry anymore. That chapter in my life is gone, but I plan to build a new chapter, a new home.
With so much of this community destroyed by the Eaton fire, and so many of the residents having to start over, and I guess trying to figure out whether they even can, one thing is clear. Whatever comes next for Altadena is likely to be very different from what was there.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Lumen. When your metabolism is working properly, you will feel the benefits. With the Lumen device, you can measure your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. Take the next step to improving your health. Go to lumen.me/codeswitch to get 20% off your Lumen.
This message comes from Schwab. At Schwab, how you invest is your choice, not theirs. That's why when it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices. You can invest and trade on your own. Plus, get advice and more comprehensive wealth solutions to help meet your unique needs. With award-winning service, low costs, and transparent advice, you can manage your wealth your way at Schwab. Visit schwab.com to learn more.
This message comes from CarMax. CarMax knows that finding the right car is all about exploring your options, like the option to shop your way on your schedule. At CarMax, you can browse, compare, and pre-qualify online, then finish up at the store, or simply start on the lot. The choice is yours, because at CarMax, you're in the driver's seat. Start the search for your next car today at CarMax, the way car buying should be.
Jaira Dang is a reporter who lives close to Altadena, and they've been covering the Eaton fire since the fire came through on January 7th. Jaira, what's good? And welcome to Code Switch.
Hey, Gene. Thanks for having me.
So, Jaira, what have you been seeing? What have people been saying to you?
I've spent a lot of time with residents in the past few weeks, and when I first went past the police line the week the fire started, it was really, really creepy. Some houses were spared on blocks that were completely flattened. And it's because the fire wasn't spreading from house to house, The wind was actually pushing it miles from block to block.
Wow.
And we know that wildfires and the winds don't discriminate when they destroy people's homes. But the losses after the Eaton fire hit the Black community in Altadena particularly hard.
Okay, so why were the Black residents of Altadena hit so hard by the fires?
Right. There's this road called Lake Avenue that divides Altadena into two. And residents west of Lake Avenue, where there are more Black and working class residents, received an evacuation emergency notice a full 6 hours later than their neighbors, literally a block east of them.
Wow. Okay, so when you say emergency notification, you mean like one of those really loud buzzes like on your phone that you get saying like something is happening?
Yes.
Okay.
And the west side of Altadena is the area that we're seeing way more casualties.
Huh.
It's also where long-standing communities of Black families built homes in the 1960s. And now, with the amount of time and money that it's going to take to rebuild, it's really uncertain whether a lot of them are going to be able to pass their homes down to their children.
Huh. So it seems like, although Altadena broadly was one of the few places in California that Black folks could buy homes back in the day, there's still residential segregation within the town itself, which is why you have folks on one side of Lake Avenue being more harshly affected by the fire than other people. Just to back up a little bit, why did Altadena even become the kind of place where Black folks in California decided they wanted to settle down in the first place?
So Black people have been coming to Altadena since the 1800s.
Okay.
Robert Owens was born into slavery, and he bought his family's freedom in the 1850s.
He lived up what's called the Meadows on the El Prieto Trail, and the indigenous people, he lived there with them.
That's Veronica Jones, the first Black president of the Altadena Historical Society.
He became really rich by cutting the trees in the forest, bringing them down to L.A. to the military. And he became one of the wealthiest African Americans in L.A. County.
Owens helped set the stage for Altadena to become a space for Black wealth, as well as working class folks who eventually settled there. Fast forward almost a century later, and the Great Migration actually led many Black families to settle in Altadena and Pasadena to build one of the first middle-class Black communities in California in the post-civil rights era. But, of course, we know that the neighborhood wasn't necessarily a Black utopia.
Of course. There's no way it was that simple.
Yeah, prior to World War II, the area was predominantly white. And even though housing policy changed, segregation and redlining left their mark. In 1960, Black people only made up 4% of residents in Altadena. But that number grew to 44% in the 1980s. Julie Bassie-Threets remembers when her family first moved to Altadena in the 60s.
I was 10 in 1967. That's when they bought the house. It was a struggle for my parents, I think, initially, because there weren't a lot of African Americans living up there. And when my parents went to go view the house on an open house, they didn't want to let them in. Which made my dad even more determined to buy the house. So he wrote the broker's name down and went and found the broker and told him, I want to see that house and I want to buy that house today. And that's how we got there. Yes.
I spoke to Barbara Richardson King, who became a realtor in the 80s. She remembers when realtors practiced something called steering to keep Black people out of certain areas.
You know, if you said you wanted to live on Maiden Lane, which is east of Lake, they would steer you over to a neighborhood. They had these unspoken rules, you know, that realtors were following and didn't want to be the first one to, what they say, kind of break in the neighborhood, you know, and cause white flight.
Yeah, there's so many things that lead to housing segregation in communities, right? You got redlining, you got things like this, like steering. You got things like people ramming highways and expressways through residential neighborhoods and breaking them up.
Exactly. And that's actually what led Julie's family to move to Altadena in the first place.
We were displaced by the 210 freeway. When the 210 freeway came through, ours was the last house on the block that they took.
Thousands of Black families lost their homes in the 50s and 60s when it was taken by eminent domain when they were planning to connect the 210 and 710 freeways.
Eminent domain is when the government says, we need this private property and we want to take it from you so we can build some, public works project because for the good of everybody. In cities all over the country, we've seen this used for things like, the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago or, the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York. And those infrastructure projects, those highways, just helped shape the racial geography of those big cities. Just like it seemed like happened in Altadena.
Right. This is nothing new for the Black community in Altadena that's had to rebuild time and time again. All of this hurt in regards to the Eaton fire comes from a real place of hurt that Black residents have had their homes taken away from them intentionally before.
I am saddened. I'm frustrated. There's no one to blame, no finger to point. This is a natural disaster. The freeway was not.
That was Marcus Williams, an elder at Friendship Church in Pasadena. The church used to be the heart of a thriving Black community in Old Town Pasadena until the expansion of 2 local freeways in the 1950s and 60s.
As usual, the Black community takes the brunt of, as it did here, you choose the Black community because we don't have the numbers or the economic influence to stop it, like South Pasadena stopped the 710 freeway from going through.
So Marcus is actually referring to South Pasadena, where a lot of white and affluent residents were able to stop the freeway from coming through their neighborhood. And so that's the irony, is that the freeway was never fully completed, but many of those Black families lost their homes in Pasadena as a result of those freeways. And then they moved to Altadena as part of that wave of building a middle-class Black neighborhood on the west side in the 70s and 80s. But their distrust still permeates and colors how they see the Eaton fire crisis.
There is racial inequity that permeates Southern California like everywhere else. But this hurts because this was truly an act of nature. Or an act of God's, call it what you like, and we will see how the community recovers.
The word community is really key here because Pasadena and Altadena are really closely interwoven. A lot of residents here just refer to both places as Dena. And one of the biggest concerns about recovering after this disaster is whether the community will get to stay intact.
Huh.
I talked to one resident, Brandon Garner, who saved his grandparents' home in Altadena with just a garden hose. He feels like the fires have made Altadena more susceptible to development.
So I get the newsletters. I know what they, what the vision is and so forth. So
Jaffer, what's really interesting listening to this is, on one hand, like Altadena is this enclave of Black folks who, found this sort of like, low density, suburban style place to live in California. And it was affordable when they moved in. But like when you talk to people about the sort of housing crisis throughout California and LA County in particular, they talk about the fact that the kind of housing that dots Los Angeles, which is like single family, low density housing, means that there just isn't enough housing for everybody, which means there's like a lot of crunch on people who either want to rent or buy homes because there's just never enough housing stock. I'm just thinking about the sort of like a tension here, which is that like Altadena is this enclave that is rare in so many ways. And also places like Altadena, in terms of their layout, are like part of what so many people see as the problem of affordability in California. So what does Brandon mean by the vision? I mean, isn't it a net good if, people want to come in and build more housing in Altadena and Pasadena because LA County famously has a severe housing shortage?
What Brandon is talking about is also the issue of gentrification in Los Angeles County. So even though there have been efforts to build more dense housing in these suburbs where they're zoned off for single-family homes, a lot of the times when these developers come in, they're not building affordable apartments. They're building luxury development. And in a lot of instances, it further accelerates the gentrification that pushes out people of color from their own neighborhoods.
So, and this was happening before the fire.
Right.
New state-of-the-art buildings, things of that nature, stuff, industrial type, settings. It's just, it's all about a look, but it's not necessarily about a look. It's about getting the value for the land. It's not, I've seen people's houses being bought and then stores put on them, things of that nature. Like, what happened to the residency? Like, why you take 3 houses and turn it into a grocery store, or 3 houses and turn it in just to a building that ain't nobody using?
Coming up, the scale of this destruction in Altadena, combined with this housing crisis, has a lot of people asking, who will get to rebuild and return to this town?
Nobody's coming to save us. We have to embrace each other. We have to be community focused. We have to rebuild together.
Stay with us.
This message comes from Thuma. Create your oasis with Thuma, a modern design company that specializes in furniture and home goods. By stripping away everything but the essential, Thuma makes elevated beds with premium materials and intentional details. With clean lines, subtle curves, and minimalist style, the Thuma bed collection is available in 4 signature finishes to match any design aesthetic. To get $100 towards your first bed purchase, go to thuma.co/NPR. This message comes from Intuit TurboTax. Now, taxes is matching with an expert backed by tech to get you the most money back at TurboTax.com. Experts only available with TurboTax Live. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
This message comes from Viking, committed to exploring the world in comfort. Journey through the heart of Europe on an elegant Viking longship with thoughtful service, destination-focused dining, and cultural enrichment on board and on shore. And every Viking voyage is all-inclusive with no children and no casinos. Discover more at Viking.com.
Gene.
Jaira.
Code Switch. So, Jaira, we've been talking about the Eaton fire in Altadena, California, and how, because of the racial and socioeconomic makeup of Altadena, you got Black and you have brown working-class families who have been disproportionately feeling the brunt of the damage from the wildfires. Obviously, LA is notoriously one of the most difficult housing markets in the country. Everything is mad expensive, and there's more demand than there is supply. So how does the destruction of places like Altadena and even the Pacific Palisades in the West, where there were also fires, complicate this dynamic around housing?
Well, it just means that there's now even a greater demand for housing than there was before.
Nothing is really affordable anymore, so it's a crisis. It's a national crisis. The average person can't compete.
That's Herman Allison. He and his wife Aldra recently lost their home in Altadena. They both actually happen to also be housing experts. Aldra actually came out of retirement at 68 to work with the city of Pasadena to help seniors find affordable housing. And the irony is that she and her husband are now in the same boat.
There's no doubt that I will one day rebuild my house. Okay, that's my goal. Even though I'm older, retired, basically semi-retired, I plan to rebuild my home. If you're going to have generational wealth in your families have to come together and help you rebuild.
I've already heard from residents that there's been rental price gouging and developers already trying to go in and purchase property from retired seniors whose homes burned down.
There's so many developers out there sending letters, misinformation to people. There's a danger, a serious danger in Altadena, now that we have all these vacant lots, of outside developers coming in, not to replace single-family houses, but to increase the so-called need for more housing.
Aldra is really worried that the fires could accelerate gentrification if developers outside of the community start building luxury apartments in Altadena like she's been seeing in Pasadena. And Aldra's concerns aren't unfounded. The first burnt-down home already sold in Altadena for over $500,000 in all cash.
So it's already starting. Okay, so is anyone trying to protect Altadena from being bought up by developers?
Yes, I spoke to local representative Judy Chu.
This is a disaster that has left people shell-shocked, numb, not knowing where to go. And they need help from the federal government to ensure that they can live the life that they had always hoped to have.
Chu's office has also demanded an independent investigation into why the west side of Altadena received delayed evacuation notices. Then there's Catherine Barger, the county supervisor for Altadena. She's kind of like the mayor for this unincorporated town.
For me, Altadena is not for sale. If you look at the history of Altadena, even when it comes to the redlining, that really is a place that for the African-American community represents so much. And I want to make sure that we don't let that history go away and that we provide the opportunity for the next generation, because while we're not redlining now, in a way we are, because the cost of housing is so expensive that it is pricing many young African-American families out of the market, and they're having to move away.
Black home ownership in Altadena is endangered. More than half of Black homeowners in Altadena are over the age of 65, and many of them might not have the energy or the resources to rebuild. Even before this fire, the median home in Altadena was over $1 million, and that was already driving the gentrification in this town. So, to help keep some of Altadena's original community, Barger is contemplating a land trust that would allow the county to purchase homes and ensure they're passed on to people and not corporations.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about, individual homeowners, right? But what about the renters in Altadena?
Yeah, there were a lot of affordable rentals in Altadena. I've been speaking with one family, the Larkins, who lost their home that they had been renting in the fires.
The rent was affordable. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be able to have stayed there. Very affordable. The landlord she raised rent on me twice, but only by $50. So, and you wouldn't believe how much I was paying for a house that big. I lived there for 36 or 38 years, something like that.
That was Margaret, who's 66 years old and the matriarch of her family. I spent the day with Margaret and her daughter Camila as they were trying to get their lives back together after the fires. They were doing everything from going to FEMA to get their lost documents printed and also checking on their mail at their new P.O. box.
Isn't the FEMA place right around here too? They were doing the free birth certificate, death certificate, marriage certificate. And so I had applied for all of those because all those got lost in the fire too. I wasn't able to grab those. So I can't remember if they said pick it up here.
Every day is just a long checklist of things that they have to handle. It's exhausting, replacing things like medicine that burned down with her home.
I didn't grab my medicine. I thought I grabbed all of them, and Trulicity was in the fridge. You have to keep that in the fridge.
And what do you need your Trulicity for?
They're all for diabetes. Diabetes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, life is hard enough without having to worry about replacing the medication you need because you lost it in the fire. That's bananas. Wow.
Yeah. And to add to it all is the question of toxic waste that needs to be cleaned up from the area before things can be rebuilt. The houses that burned were old, and a lot of them had things like asbestos and lead paint and all sorts of other toxic chemicals, that's been burnt to ashes and left on these properties. Mm-hmm. And right now, there's a lot of questions about how the EPA is going to clean up all of it. We're not used to dealing with an urban fire of this magnitude.
Yeah, so this is like unprecedented. But there's something with big tragedies we see over and over again, right? Like an earthquake, a shooting, a storm. Like people will pay attention at the very beginning, donations will come in. But then, national and international attention goes away. This is obviously happening already to the fires. So how are folks dealing with the world kind of moving on from this cataclysm?
Residents have been turning to each other. Organic mutual aid efforts popped up everywhere from the Santa Anita racetrack, where thousands of donations poured in, to Black churches like Friendship Baptist Church, where Marcus Williams is a pastor.
The history of this church is the foundation for what will be going into the future for the community. We don't give up. Maya Angelou encapsulated in Still I Rise. That's who we are. We have suffered innumerable, immeasurable things that would have crushed a lesser people. But still, we are here and we are surviving, and we will come back.
I also visited Nikki High, who owns the first Black woman-owned bookstore in Pasadena called Octavia's Bookshelf.
Quick aside here, Octavia Butler, who is from Pasadena and buried in Altadena, envisioned in her novel Parable of the Sower fires ravaging LA neighborhoods. And that was set in the year 2025. And that book came out in 1993. And so a lot of people have been referring to Butler's work as they've watched the news about the LA wildfires.
Yes, her work is definitely front of mind for folks. Nikki, a fellow Butler fan, of course, transformed her bookstore into a place for community to gather and get resources.
After the first night of evacuation, I was attempting to access Wi-Fi just to contact my homeowner's insurance and FEMA and just figure things out. So I came to the bookstore and then I realized that I had Wi-Fi. So I thought, well, I bet other people need to get online. So I just made a post and I said, hey, everybody, I have Wi-Fi and power. If you need somewhere to come to get online, come on in. And maybe a few hours later, somebody said, hey, I have some water to donate if you need some water while you're in the shop. Within 6 hours after that, I became a distribution center.
She was stocking bookshelves with shampoo, conditioner, lotion, first aid, antibacterial wipes, towels, anything that people didn't have when they left their homes. There was even a separate food section with freshly made burritos.
And the devastation was just so severe. I just couldn't think of any other place I would want to be during an event like this. But also, it feels very full circle for me. This community helped me open the bookstore. They helped save it when, we had some financial trouble. And to be able to give back in a meaningful and tangible way just feels like the right thing to do.
Nikki actually grew up in Northwest Pasadena and eventually bought a home in Altadena.
I was raised here in Pasadena and Altadena. I learned to swim in the Jackie Robinson pool. We went to amusement parks. We had art camps in the Kings Manor, which is now called the Kings Villages. I remember when I moved to Altadena, when we bought a house in Altadena, and I was like, yes, I've made it. I made it up the street, because Altadena was like the place where Black people were extraordinarily prosperous. It wasn't unusual for them to have, 2, 3, 4 houses in the community that they owned. You knew the families that owned group homes and foster homes and the ones who had daycares and schools. And so it was a really special moment to me when I was able to finally purchase a home in Altadena.
Her home narrowly escaped being burnt down. On her block, there were homes to the left and to the right of her that were completely destroyed. It's been a lot to take in. But like Eugene, Nikki has been looking towards Octavia Butler's work in Parable of the Sower for hope.
Parable of the Sower opened on July 20th, 2024. It's like a post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. There's droughts, there's, extreme weather patterns, racial divide. It feels very relevant. And so the book is written through a series of journal entries by the main character, Lauren Oya Alamina, who is 15 years old at the time. And so in her journal on February 1st, 2025 is when she said, "Today the fire started." I personally see Parable of the Sower less of a prediction and more of a guidebook. Octavia Butler was very well studied, so she didn't get a vision or fall asleep and then something was revealed to her. And so she, had been thinking and studying global warming as early as the 80s.
There's this famous quote from Octavia Butler where she addresses the question of how she's been so prescient in her writing, whether she could predict the future. And she said, I'm going to quote her here, "All I did was look around at the problems we're neglecting now and give them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters."
Mm-hmm. So relevant. And it's easy to get stuck in the hopelessness of that thought. But Nikki focuses on the hope that Butler's work eventually leads us to. She says the author leaves us a manual on how to rebuild after disaster.
The other part of Parable of the Sower is a blueprint of hope. Lauren Olamina is rebuilding. She's rebuilding, and she's basing that on community and, feeding each other and being accountable for one another. Lauren Olamina, I know there's a part of Parable of the Sower where she says, "Embrace diversity or die." And that really feels so important right now because nobody's coming to save us. We have to embrace each other. We have to be community focused. We have to rebuild together. And so I hope that as people are reading Parable of the Sower, once you get over the shock at how just engaged and smart and researched Octavia Butler was, that you see this story of hope.
And that's our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. If email is more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or, wherever it is you get your podcast. You can also subscribe to our newsletter by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter. And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and to support public media more broadly. And you get to listen to every episode sponsor free. So please go holler at plus.npr.org/Code Switch. This episode that you're listening to was produced by Xavier Lopez and Christina Kala. It was edited by Christina Kala and Dalia Mortada. Our engineer was Kwesi Lee. And I'd be remiss if I did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch Massive: Jess Kung, Leah Danella, Courtney Stein, Verlin Williams, and B.A. Parker.
And a special thanks to Janet Wujong Lee, who taught me how to hold a microphone properly.
I'm Gene Demby.
I'm Jaira Dang.
Be easy, y'all.
See y'all later.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Boll & Branch. Change your sleep with the softness of Boll & Branch's 100% organic cotton sheets. Feel the difference with 15% off your first set of sheets at bollandbranch.com with code NPR. Exclusions apply. See site for details. This message comes from Bombas. Socks, underwear, and T-shirts are the top 3 requested clothing items by people experiencing homelessness. Bombas makes all 3 and donates 1 item for every item purchased. Go to bombas.com/NPR and use code NPR for 20% off. This message comes from Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile took what's wrong with wireless and made it right. They offer premium wireless plans for less, and all plans include high-speed data, unlimited talk and text, and nationwide coverage. See for yourself at mintmobile.com/switch.